Welcome back to the Making International Law in Korea video series. In this video, I'll be explaining to you one of the important issues of the international in Korea, which is the history and theoretical approach of Korea in international law. The discipline of international law in Korea and the assimilation and acceptance of Korea should be noted first. The circumstances surrounding Korea's acquisition of knowledge on the European-oriented international law and Korea's acceptance of the international law as a sovereign state are typically discussed altogether as part of the history of introduction and adoption of the international law in Korea. While those two issues are closely related, they also must be separately discussed. It was Martin's translation and publication of Helly Witten's Elements of International Law under the Chinese title of the Public Law of All Nations in 1864 that has a huge impact on the discipline of the West-oriented international law in East Asia. In Chinese term is the Mangu Gongpo is pretty much influenced the many parts of the international developed at the time. According to the record, a Japanese envoy to Korea at the time brought 2 copies of the book on international law to Cho Young-ha, at the time then Minister of Culture and Education of Korea, on December 1877. One of the copies was called Wangu Gongpa, and the other is another Chinese translation of the literature by the Martins. The instance explains one of the view on Korea's first encounter with international law. However, there are widely divergent views on this issue. In fact, Korea sent envoys to China more than 23 times between the year of the 1894, when Mangu Gongpo was published and in 1876, when very first modern treaty known as the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Kingdom of Korea and the Empire of Japan was concluded. Based on the number of diplomatic exchanges and relations with China and Japan at the time, it is highly probable that Korean envoys to China brought home a copy of the Manju Gongpa along with the Western literature on international law. Moreover, at the time, the treaty between Korea and Japan was concluded in 1876. The report by Parkhurst, then British Minister to Japan, revealed that Korean delegation has possessed a copy of this book, Wangu Gongpa, and copies of treaties concluded by China with other foreign countries. Consequently, it can be reasonably presumed that Korea became acquainted to international law around the time of the publication of the Wangu Gongpa, or at least prior to 1876, when the first modern treaty with Japan was concluded. Upon the introduction of international law from the West, under the title of the Wangu Gongpa, Korean internationally or international intellectuals generally showed 3 different attitudes toward international law. The first group of intellectuals argued that the Korea must actively incorporate international law as a means to preserve its independence and to prevent wars. They had great expectations for international law as the knowledge on international law began to be disseminated. On the other hand, the second group kept a skeptical attitude toward international law. They argued that international law represents only the interests of the powerful states, even though the principle of justice operates along the line of international law on its face. This reflects the view that international law is of the no use in a context of realities of international politics unless states invoking international law are empowered themselves with independence and autonomy. Lastly, the third group, they maintain the view that Korea must utilize legal reasoning in international law to preserve its independence. This group, they emphasize the significance of the complying with the international law, as a weak state could invoke international law against powerful states as a legal base. The way international law came to a norm and applied in Korea is different from how international law was disseminated in the country. The fact that Korea became governed by international law, therefore being part of the community of international law, is supported by the number of indications such as the application of traditional international law, for example, law of the war and maritime law, and state recognition, the establishment of the diplomatic relations, and the conclusion of treaties. In particular, the conclusion of treaties bears significance. International law governs law and acts that directly relate to the conclusion of treaties and is equivalent to the international legal acts of a state subject to international law. In this respect, the conclusion of treaties is a symbolic act which indicates when state is to be regulated by international law. Accordingly, Korea's acceptance of international law as a binding norm is deemed to have begun with the conclusion of a treaty of peace and friendship with Japan in 1876. Notably, while China and Japan concluded their first modern international treaty with Western countries, such as Britain and the United States respectively, Korea signed its first international treaty with Japan, which concluded its first treaty of peace and amity with the United States on March 31st of 1854. Korea's first modern treaty with Japan is viewed as a reflection of Japan's influence regarding its experience of being forced to open its door to the West and sign an unequal treaty. The Charter of the United Nations addressed the equal rights of the nations, both large and small. The document introduced the principle of sovereign equality to all of its members, as seen in Article 2.1. As such, in light of principles of international law, such nations, as holders of sovereign rights, are to be held equal by the law. Apart from the principle of the equality under the legal perspective, however, in reality, the nations are never equal in regard to its relationship to others. The cause of this inequality is commonly pointed out to be nations' power. However, inequality may also be attributed to the other factors, such as territory, population, economic power, military power, social system, and economic efficiency, and power information and culture. As the relationship among states is never equal, the existence of the inequality in the international community is inevitable. The international community is an equal society, both legally and formally, but not in reality. Some have foreseen such an inequality early on and have regarded the international community as oligarchical, the society governed by the most powerful countries. The equality within the international community is evident in international law. First of all, in the area of international organizational law, the rights and duties of nations are prescribed differently between the powerful and weak countries with accordance with each nation's political, military, and economic power. Some key examples include the permanent members of United Nations Security Council who possesses special standing with veto rights, as well as the Monetary Fund, so-called the IMF, the voting rights at the Board of Governors, which differ according to quotas and subscriptions, wherein the 5 states with the largest quota have a right to appoint candidates for executive directors. Similarly, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, also called World Banks, gave the nation different voting powers at the Board of Governors according to share of stocks. This IBRD recognized the superior rank of member states, where such valued nations are given primary industrial importance when appointing governments the representative in formatting a board of directors of International Labour Organization, the ILO. A discrepancy is also seen in concerning in international shipping service and international seaborne trade or shipholding volume as important factors when establishing the Council and Maritime Safety Committee under the International Maritime Organization. Within the European Union, differences in voting rights also exist among the member states in the composition of the European Parliament or the Council. In the area of disarmament, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons or Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is not enforced yet, is a typical example of the inequality in the international community, wherein the vested rights of countries with nuclear weapons have been recognized. This has raised the issue of legal discrimination between the nations possessing nuclear powers and those who do not possess any nuclear weapons. Not only does international reflect the inequality within the international community, it also plays an active role in redressing such inequality and strengthening the legal protection of weaker nations in the community. The international law of development, for example, directly shows the international community's efforts in pursuing substantive equality through the international law. According to the logics of international law of development, nations with advanced industries have a duty to cooperate for the economic development and self-reliance of the less developed countries that are economically weaker. The system under the World Trade Organization WTO provides a number of special treatment provisions that give due consideration to the least developed countries and developed countries, while also recognizing the principle of special and differential treatment for the developing countries, including the generalized system of preference recognized under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is a GATT system. Furthermore, other international organizations such as the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, were also established to secure the substantial equality in international community based on the logics of international law of development. Also, the principle of the shared but differentiated responsibility is regarded as one of the efforts with the international community to realize the substantial equality under international law, which impose a greater responsibility on developed nations in the deep seafloor development system under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea or the International Environment Law by recognizing deep seafloor natural resources as common heritage of mankind.